Readers, listeners, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. I'm so excited today. We are about to dive into entirely new terrain, just mixing a metaphor there. Today, we are about to dive into our very first foray into dragon smut. So, those of you who have been tuning in for a while know that, in fact, I'm not like a huge bestseller kind of person. My concern with bestsellers is often that, the prose just isn't going to rise to the very high standards that I have for prose. So I always really enjoy when a bestseller either has incredible prose or has a couple of other elements that are sort of enticing enough that I really feel like it is worthy of a deep dive here on the Foxed Page. You also know, just from probably listening in, that I'm not like a big fantasy gal. So this is clear from the list of all of the books that we have read together here at the Foxed Page. I don't even know if there's a single fantasy book on there. I mean, I think the last thing that I read fantasy-wise that I really enjoyed was like A Wrinkle in Time. I didn't love the Harry Potter stuff. Definitely did not dive into The Lord of the Rings. I really loved the television series of Game of Thrones, but was not in fact compelled to read those books. But I was compelled to dive into Rebecca Yarros's series because I was recently spending some time with a bunch of youngsters. And by youngsters, I mean 24-year-olds. And they were talking about a slight sort of guilty pleasure for them. This is also a group of people who has very, very high standards for prose, and they were totally taken by this fantasy series. So, of course, I was listening in and like trying to have an open mind once I got over my own snobbery about literature and was really trying to sort of understand what it was that they were really enjoying in the Fourth Wing series. And, there was enough to entice me that I zipped around the corner and went into a bookstore and came away with this gigantic book. Once again, I am so impressed. It's like with Northwoods or Covenant of Water or Demon Copperhead. I mean, people are reading gigantic books these days, which makes me so happy. People are not afraid to dive into like 1,000 pages. This one's not 1,000. It's like, I don't know. Well, I'm going to tell you right now. It's about 517 pages, but it is really, really popular. Today, we're mostly going to stick to the beginning. There are going to be no plot spoilers, so feel free, to listen to this either once you're in the book, after you finished it, or also before you have in fact read it. If you, like me, are just sort of curious about what it is that is making this book so incredibly popular with people. So, I mean, is this like, really excellent literary prose? No, but some of what she's doing is incredibly effective and I think explains some of the reason why it's so readable. I was also kind of low-key interested in why it was that so many of these young women were interested in Fourth Wing. Just sort of like, what is it that makes this a little bit more of a woman's book? Although I brought it home, and both my husband and my elder son, who he likes to read fantasy fiction, and they both were interested. It looks pretty like not gender-coded from the front, but then one of them heard from one of the other youngsters who was hanging out that it was the Dragon Smut book. I think they actually said dragon sex. And I was like, or the sexy dragon book, something like that. And I was like, wait, what are we talking about here? Like sex between dragons? Are we talking about sex between people? Are we talking about sex with people and dragons? And they were like, well, you're going to have to read to find out. I'm just kidding. They did not say that. They're like, mostly sex, mostly sex between people. So that, once it was labeled dragon smut, both my husband and my son were like, no, thank you. But my curiosity was even further piqued because I have always had a hard time with erotica. Erotica is like the old word that we used to use for it. I really like the word smut. I just think it's like a real improvement. So I was interested in that aspect too, because I was like, wow, it is really hard to write well about sex. And, this is also, again, a discerning group of 20-somethings who I just was curious about what it was that was engaging them, on the smut front. So I was drawn in by the popularity, by the idea that it was appealing to women, by the idea that there was like some good smut in there. But I also, very quickly, once I started reading the gigantic book from the bookstore around the corner, I got into these other two questions, one of which is why so much fantasy writing is set in the medieval era. And that is something we are going to get into today. The other question, which is so interesting to me, is why so much young adult fiction, and in fact so much fantasy fiction, is written by Mormon writers. That is another question we are going to get into. So we'll talk about the medieval stuff and this Mormon stuff before we dive into the actual book itself. Really, really interesting, I think, interesting questions and some really interesting answers. The reason the Mormon thing came up is because I had glanced at the jacket copy, at this picture. If you're watching on the YouTube, I will hold up the picture of Rebecca Yarros that comes with the book there. Also, if you're on the YouTube, you will notice that I am wearing what looks kind of like a metallic shield. It's not a shield. It's not leather either. It's like some sort of synthetic fabric. My husband gave this to me, and I'm wearing it, of course, because I am in solidarity with our Violet, and also apparently with this metallic book. Didn't even notice the book was metallic until I had it in this light. So the reason the Mormon thing came up was that I had glanced at that picture and my husband said, she's got 6 kids, which I did not know. And I have to say that that really made me feel inferior, not because I want to have 6 children, but because I was like, what? How is this woman writing all of these uber popular, super long books while she's also raising 6 children? I also found out that her husband is in the military. And so he was literally off on these deployments while she was raising all these children and writing all of these incredibly successful books. So I was like, oh my God, basically what have I done recently? However, I got over all of that and then got very interested in this question of what is it about Mormon writers that lends them, to this YA and fantasy world? And I also was thinking dragon smut, Mormon. I just was having a little cognitive dissonance there and was a little I'm very curious to see how this is going to go down. The interesting thing to that is I don't have a conclusion, but we are going to discuss both, Rebecca Yarros, just a couple tidbits about her. We're going to discuss somewhat in depth why the Mormon faith really seems to be compatible with a lot of young adult fiction and a lot of fantasy fiction. And then we're going to dive into the book and discuss some of the elements that seem decidedly kind of un-Mormon in this book. And I have no answers for you. I don't know. I didn't do research on Rebecca Yarros and her, her sense of the Latter-day Saints Church. I'm just going to leave it as an open question and provide you with some information. Okay. So those of you who like an agenda, I'm going to give you an agenda today. First of all, we're going to talk about that idea of fantasy fiction and why it is often in a medieval setting or a medieval-like setting. We're then going to talk about this notion of Mormon writers, and then we're going to talk about the book itself. When we dive into Fourth Wing, we're going to talk about matriarchy and a little bit about sorority. And by sorority, I mean sisterhood, not in fact sororities, and female friends. So we're going to talk about sort of the female relationships in the book. We're then going to talk about pacing and exposition, which if you don't know what those are, just, hang in there. I'll explain them soon. We're going to talk about the character arcs and how satisfying they are and what a good job Yarros does with that. We're going to talk about cliche. So, cliche obviously has negative connotations. It's definitely pejorative when I am talking about cliche. But in Yarros's hands, it actually functions pretty well. And we are going to discuss why cliche is in fact very efficient and very effective in the context of Fourth Wing. We're then going to talk a little bit about some of the levity in the book, some of the humor. It's very sort of self-aware in ways that I found very charming. And then we are going to get into the question of this smut. And we're going to actually, you should hang in because I'm going to read out loud some of the smut and it might get interesting. I mean, I just, wow, buckle up. the first thing we're going to do is tackle this question of why so much fantasy fiction is set in either like a frankly medieval period or a sort of a pseudo medieval period. And once you start thinking about it, it's really clear that lots and lots of our very, very favorite fantasy writing happens in this medieval era. Obviously, you think of Game of Thrones, you think of Lord of the Rings, that whole Philip Pullman series. I can't remember what it is now. It has that really cool kind of polar bear on the front. All the Harry Potter books. So just like really, sort of our like standby, like really, like the sort of classics of the fantasy genre are really pretty firmly situated in this kind of medieval era. Of course, you have contemporary stories. One case in point is A Wrinkle in Time. I mean, that was contemporary to my childhood, but it was not like set in the medieval period. Also, we have some books that are set in the future. Obviously, you get into like very dystopian things. A book like Fahrenheit 451 or Brave New World. I never read Brave New World. I'm just assuming that it was set in some sort of futuristic world. You also have those dystopian things, like Blade Runner. You can tell that I'm just like not that much of a fantasy reader because these are such like kind of classics and kind of icons. We're not getting into sophisticated, kind of B-side fantasy things here. But I also would argue that there's, fantasy and sci-fi get kind of lumped in together. And I think that sci-fi or speculative fiction is often more forward-looking. Fantasy is often, again, often set in a past time, very often in a world that feels, in fact, very medieval. I was actually talking to my husband about this, and he was talking about how in his mind fantasy all occurs before the combustion engine, which I thought was so interesting and kind of funny. I was like, wow, that's like a very specific thing. But when we are talking about this medieval era, I mean, really what I'm thinking about here is like castles and turrets and, bows and arrows and people riding on horseback and a little bit of like knights and dragons and magic. But I think that when people are discussing this, and there is quite a bit of scholarship on this question of the medieval world and fantasy novels, people are thinking about an era before the 19th century. I would even go back a little bit further. I would think sort of the medieval era, more like the Dark Ages, certainly before the Enlightenment. Although some of that Enlightenment thinking is pretty fantastical in lots of ways. So when my husband and I were having this conversation and he was citing, pre-combustion engine, we got to sort of, thinking on our own about all of the reasons why, before we consulted all of the scholars, the reasons why are actually very intuitive, that you would set fantasy in a world that is sort of pre-industrial. And part of that is that there's a sort of a simplicity to that world. Everything is kind of stripped down, and it's a world that you can kind of intuit as a human. You don't have to understand how you might have like a hovercraft in the future. I'm imagining hovercrafts and Blade Runner. I don't even know if that's a thing. But this idea of like most of us can kind of imagine like riding a horse or building a fire or hiking through a shire. So there are different ways that we can sort of project ourselves, anyone can, without a lot of technology, just with a little intuition and a little experience, we can kind of inhabit that world pretty comfortably. So there's a simplicity just simply to the technology. There's also this idea of like a lawlessness in that time period. So you have this idea of maps as being much less stable and as small little kingdoms kind of fighting for their lives. And you have an idea of like hand-to-hand combat and this idea of, things being on a much smaller scale, but also a time when a lot was at stake. So, you could die of a cold, you could die falling into a well, you could die of, all sorts of different things. So there is like a very high stakes, but also like a very sort of stripped down thing. So some of the, the sort of allure to that is that you would have to be a really inventive problem solver And you also would be sort of reaching for things that are either magical or very sort of simple or very kind of witch-like. You could imagine coming up with a potion or, distilling some herbs or whatever it was that you would have done then. So there's this idea of things being high stakes and things being kind of unregulated and unlawful and kind of, Wild West sort of a feel, but like a, European sort of Wild West. I mean, I think you can look at something like Westworld, and you have this idea of the Wild West as being, a very tempting place to set a fantasy. But for the most part, when we are thinking, and I think there's a real charm for a lot of Americans to look back into history, and when in that case, I mean like capital H history, like European history, not so much the history of the native indigenous peoples of our country. So there's this sense of that space and that time as being simplified, but very high stakes, and where there's some very interesting problem solving happening, and where things are in fact very desperate. On a very practical note, there's a lot of sort of plot stuff that you could get away with, in the sense that all you have to do is imagine what would happen if, during Lord of the Rings, if they had GPS and you could just drop a pin, the whole scope of the world in the novel would have changed. So when you have fewer, technological advances and fewer regulations and fewer laws and fewer maps that are stable, you're much freer to sort of come up with your own world. There is apparently a lot of world building, which I can understand as a phase. In fact, one of those youngsters I was referring to is right now making herself a whole world so that she can, in fact, write one of these novels, which I find fascinating. Maybe one day we'll be talking about it here on the Foxed Page. But this idea of world making, you can understand that it would be much more simple and much less daunting to make a world out of that kind of, that fantasy world that we're all sort of vaguely familiar with, that's not full of technology and cell phones and vaccinations and, all of these different things. One important thing, though, speaking of vaccinations and our present day, is that this kind of stripped down world of high stakes and low technology is also a really excellent place to have a lot of analogy. So when you think of Game of Thrones and you think of the way that was really, in lots of ways, was viewed as a giant metaphor for climate change, there's a way that very high stakes world that's kind of stripped down to its essence is it's a very rich way to talk about politics and to talk about climate breakdown and to talk about viruses and to talk about some of these really pressing issues of our day. I did, in fact, do a little bit of, reading of the scholarship on this. In fact, one of our sons in college did take a course on medieval sort of structures and Game of Thrones, which I just thought was so cool. How amazing to study the medieval era through a television show like Game of Thrones. Just so cool. I wish I could go to school forever. Honestly. But in my sort of looking at this scholarship, I did come across a really interesting article. It is quoting a woman named Rebecca Hines, who is a professor at Duke. And she does a course that is very much like the one my son took that has to do with the medieval era and Game of Thrones. And she has a really good statement about why she believes that the medieval era is really perfect for this kind of exploration. She says, "The medieval occupies this pre-literal, pre-realist space for us. It's a space where the fantastic feels like it could have happened, and, perhaps more importantly, it's a space that seems steep in symbol and allegory, where the figures who populate the landscape, like dragons and giants, can be more than just dragons or giants. They can be allegoric for trauma or social disintegration." I love this. This was in an article, I believe it was published by Duke, but if you Google Jessica Hines, it was written by a guy named Jeffrey Mock. So you can look that up if you want to read more about it. But I really love that idea of the allegorical, where these things can sort of mean something larger. Oh my gosh, think of Watership Down and socialism. Just really beautiful fantasy stories that allow us to look at politics and really high stakes questions of who is in control and how humans or animals are going to survive. Jessica Hines also talks about chivalric literature, and she talks about chivalric literature, so of chivalry, meaning like knights, think of like, King Arthur and the Round Table and Merlin and, like the Sherwood Forest. Is that from there? I think so, maybe. That does not sound right. I don't know. The Arthurian legend, Sword in the Stone. That's pretty safely in the Arthurian world. But according to Jessica Hines, the chivalric literature for her sort of most potently speaks to war, governance, and social power. So this is a very good segue in some ways into the sort of question of why Fourth Wing is so popular among women, which is that, yes, all of that war, governance, and social power are all very important. But chivalric literature, the novels of chivalry, also have an immense amount to do with romance and this, this idea of the white knight on the horse and the princess being, rescued, or Snow White falling asleep for 100 years and waking with the kiss of the prince. I don't even know if that's right, but I think so. We have this idea of chivalric literature as a sort of a model, having been set in, a world that's very close to the medieval era, and it having to do with all of those things. So she was talking specifically about social power. I would add, of course, this idea of love and courtship, which is, of course, very important, mostly like physical passion, but those things are very important in Fourth Wing. So we also, in The Artifice, there was an article by some guy named T.M. Tonji, which was literally like all I could find is like his little handle. I think it was like at TM Tonji at The Artifice. But he made this really interesting point, which I actually just, I think that was in the back of my mind when I said the thing about Snow White, because he made the point, which I really liked, that when we are introduced to these ideas, when we are first introduced to sort of this medieval world of magic and potions and spells and possibilities and dragons, it's often through fairy tales. And what I will say about all of this stuff is that it has tons to do with good and evil. It's very instructive. Again, it can be full of analogies and metaphors and warnings and whatnot. But so this sort of pre-19th century, T.M. Tonji was the one who was talking about, the sort of medieval era that we are loosely talking about as being pre-19th century. He also was talking about the fact that, we are first introduced to these things through fairy tales. So we're very comfortable with the idea of this imaginary world, and that fantasy stories are sort of a good extension of that. Okay, so now that we've discussed why the medieval era seems so particularly apt for fantasy fiction, we're going to go on and talk a little bit about why it is that so many fantasy writers are Mormon. In much the way that my husband and I were spending some time trying to figure out just for ourselves, like as a little thought experiment, like why is the medieval era so good for fantasy? I also was like, wonder why so many of these fantasy writers are Mormon. And sort of the thoughts that occurred to me are not like earth-shattering by any stretch, but some of them were informed by some very good friends that we had when we were in graduate school in Philadelphia. And this was a Mormon friend, and he's honestly like the most creative swearer I have ever heard in my entire life. So he didn't swear. He wouldn't be like, you motherfucker, like, fuck you, you motherfucker. I actually can't remember it now, which is so sad. I should get that guy on the blower. I should just put in a call to my friend Darren. But he was so inventive, and he just had all these hilarious and like really, sometimes cutting, often just pretty funny. Like some very, very inventive swearing was going on. And I always felt a little bad that he could not really access the F word because it's so potent and powerful when used correctly, in my opinion. But I always did think wow, if you really wanted to get into some good swearing and you couldn't use any of the kind of stock phrases, you would in fact have to get pretty creative and inventive. And in fact, I think that does sort of apply. Like if you have to, if you want to sort of, talk about good and evil or whatever the thing is, that there would be a sense of having to be creative if you had to sort of get around some of the some of the more sort of standard ways in which people use language or story arcs or tropes for romance or fantasy or whatever the thing is. Oh my gosh, those youngsters introduced me to the term romantasy, which I did not know, which I think is so excellent. I mean, romantasy, that's, Again, not a genre that I plan on spending a lot of time in, but I really do like the idea of that subgenre of both romance and fantasy. It's like the love child of romance and fantasy. So I was thinking, yes, there would be some level of sort of creativity that you would have to tap into. The other thing that was sort of more compelling is this idea of sort of the forbidden or the taboo, and whether or not there are ways to write about things that would have been taboo in your Mormon culture in some sort of like coded way. So recently I have been teaching Orlando. My copy is right around here, by Virginia Woolf. And very famously, Orlando is all about Virginia Woolf's lover, Vita Sackville West. And it's very interesting to me that right around the time in 1928, when Orlando was published, there was another novel that was published called The Veil of Sorrows. I can't remember. The Well of Sorrow, something like that. Not uplifting. And it was a book that was much more sort of obviously about love between women. And that book was censored very quickly and was sort of shut down. Apparently now it's like really, it's read by a lot of people, which is great. But that book, I don't know who it was written by. I have not read it. That book was censored, and Orlando was allowed, in fact, to be very successful because a lot of the sort of love between women was sort of camouflaged in fantasy or in fantastical elements. To be clear, it was not like that camouflaged. Like it's such a great book. Orlando is such a great book. You should read it. Oh my gosh, it's a romantasy in lots of ways. So part of me was like, maybe there's something like that happening here. Although I will say that Fourth Wing is definitely violating some codes of conduct in terms of swearing and in terms of sex. So I also was wondering if there was just the way, and this is like a little more cynical of me, but like if these really best-selling, really big books that are these sort of fantasies and romances, if they were this larger canvas to either explore some of the questions, that maybe arise for people who are Mormon, or just people in general, maybe about faith or not about faith, but some, a bigger canvas to think about some questions that maybe have to do with this code of conduct, or a way to really like in a very hyperbolic, exaggerated way to sort of disseminate, a lot of the sort of values of the church. So the cynical part of me is like, I wonder if some of these fantasies are really like very much about like having faith in like, a higher power or God or whatever the thing happens to be. Again, that does not quite, in fact, describe our Dragon Smut book that we're about to dive into. So you'll just like can't believe all of the people who are Mormon. So we have, of course, Rebecca Yarros, who is incredibly, incredibly popular right now. And very famously, Stephanie Meyer, who wrote the Vampire Twilight series. That's a contemporary book. We talked about that before. I did not read any of those books. But we have, that's one, it's kind of like My Wrinkle in Time in that it was set in the contemporary world of the early aughts, I think. But is clearly a fantasy story because it's all about vampires. We have Brandon Mull, who wrote the Fablehaven series. When my kids were reading it, we called it Fabelhaven, which I think we just were putting a little German flair on it. But I'm fairly certain that it is pronounced Fablehaven by Brandon Mull. Also, Brandon Sanderson is now really just hitting on all cylinders, as far as I can tell, and really churning out some very large books, a few of which are kicking around our house. So we have these very, very successful people. Also, Orson Scott Card, who wrote Ender's Game, which is such a hugely, hugely important book for so many people. At our local bookstore, there's a young woman who has a tattoo of The Enemy's Gate being down, which is an Ender's Game thing. I did not read Ender's Game, in fact, but that is a book that's extremely important for lots of people. And I think people are surprised, in fact, to hear that people like Stephanie Meyer, because I think those Twilight books were pretty sexy. Stephanie Meyer, Orson Scott Card, some of these people who are not, they're not leading with their Mormonism, but I do think that, the sort of confines of that religion are very sort of widely known. And, I think there's some interest in what it would be like to be a person who is Mormon by the general population. So it's interesting to think about those, authors who we feel like we know so well through their fiction to understand, that they may have a slightly different picture of the world in terms of their faith and also how they feel that they should conduct themselves or that people in general should. Now we're going to move on and take a quick look at a couple of articles that dive into this question of why the Mormon community writes so much and so effectively in this YA genre. So there were a bunch of different articles. It was so interesting to me, not so much scholarship, so much as kind of, more contemporary kind of editorial pieces or think pieces about why, they all say Utah, about why Utah is kind of like this epicenter for a lot of fantasy. And of course, by Utah, I think Utah is sort of like synonymous in lots of ways with Brigham Young University, which apparently is like a fantasy book incubator. So a lot of this information, got to get my citation out there, comes from the New York Times. It's something called the Morning Newsletter. I don't get it, but I searched this out on Google. This is an article written by a woman named Lauren Jackson, and it was surprising to me. There are presses, and there are lots of courses at BYU, and BYU is in fact, I think, owned and operated by the Church of Latter-day Saints. So the Mormon Church, very famously, is a very big part of the fabric in Utah. So the idea of this hotbed of YA literature as being in Utah has everything to do with this Mormon community. So when you think about YA fiction, this young adult fiction, a lot of it is fantasy. There's like the Venn diagram would be like, very much purple if it were blue and red. You have this real overlap between YA fiction and fantasy fiction. So one of the reasons why YA fiction works so well in the Mormon community is that a lot of the fiction is sort of family friendly. If it's YA, it's generally supposed to be clean, not a lot of expletives, not a lot of crazy sex, not a lot of, like drug use or whatever. Also, to be clear, not a lot of like homosexual, love and relationships, which is obviously very problematic for me personally. But this idea of the sort of family-friendly literature as being appropriate for young adults really sort of meshes well with this idea of the Mormon Church's code of conduct. So the Mormon Church's code of conduct, according to this article by Lauren Jackson, is no alcohol, no smoking, no caffeine, no swearing, no sex outside of marriage, and no gay or lesbian sex. So we're going to get to that when we talk about Fourth Wing, because obviously Fourth Wing violates many of those items on the code of conduct. But a lot of YA fiction, in fact, would not, and a lot of fantasy fiction would sort of get you around a bunch of this stuff. So there are a bunch of kind of reasons that were very appealing to me why the Mormon community is very good at writing young A fiction. One is the influence of scripture. So, my God, you guys, like these big books that people are churning out, like all of these fat YA books, very similar to the big fat Bible, This idea that is not intimidating to think about a big old 1,000-page book if you grow up with the Bible and a lot of reverence for the Bible. So you have this idea of scripture, and actually you can think of some of the like hyperbolic elements of the Bible as really, not being that far away from the idea of fantasy. That is my own, sort of take on the Bible. That is not, in fact, I am not Mormon. I am, agnostic/atheistic. Really just mainly atheistic, but like hedging my bets a little bit with that agnosticism. But it makes sense to me that if you're like really steeped in like burning bushes, and in theirs, like, the tablets, like, I don't know, there are tablets in Utah that like have powers and whatnot. Like that's all very fantasy in lots of ways in my mind. But this idea of an origin story that is really palpable and that is really shared by the community and is discussed a lot, all of that would really breed a very healthy respect for stories and really the power of literature. So you have this influence of scripture. You also have a real culture of readers. I did not know this, but apparently a lot of emphasis in the Mormon community is placed on reading and, apparently reading some long books. But there is this sense of reading as being highly valued and as being very much promoted. There's also a lot of emphasis on sort of the hero's journey. And that was one of the things that Lauren Jackson, I think it was one of the like subheadings in the article. But it's important for me to think a little bit further, because hero's journey in lots of ways is just about good and evil. So, obviously a hero is sort of, by definition, if you have a hero, you also have some villains that are involved. And I have some real reservations about who gets cast as the villain in a lot of these stories. I'd be happy if it were a dragon and not sort of, like a dragon that stands for anything else. That might be something that I actually feel very good about. So I'm a little bit concerned sometimes about good and evil and this idea of like stories that really pit good against evil, because I think definitions of good and evil are suspect. We should always sort of, approach those with caution. But again, I will say that if a lot of this is about, dragons, like fire-breathing dragons that are going to burn up communities, that's a pretty safe way to have evil. So I think there is this very neat kind of coincidence between a lot of the biblical underpinnings of Mormonism and a lot of this sort of, a lot of the tropes in fantasy writing. As we dive into the book, super quick recap, we're going to always pay close attention to the title, any dedication or frontis matter. Then we're going to take a look at the fiction. After we've done that kind of preliminary look, that little dipping our toe, we are going to talk about matriarchy, the pacing and exposition, character arcs, cliche, levity and humor, and then we're going to take a look at the smut. We're going to just dive into some of what we used to call erotica. Okay, of course, if you are tuning into the Fox page to become a better reader, the thing that I always say is all you have to do is pay attention. So here, we're going to just look at this cover here. I really like the blurb at the top here, the most brutally addictive fantasy I've read in a decade. So that is by a #1 New York Times bestselling author, Tracy Wolff. I don't know what Tracy Wolff writes, but I love the idea of brutally addictive. And I do know that these books, there's several of them and they are long. I do think that they have caused several of those youngsters I was alluding to, they've had to like put their lives on pause a little while they have really plowed through these books. I like the fact that we have the dragons are kind of front and center. Interestingly, of course, we have, the light dragon in the middle, and then we have the dark dragon. So this idea of good and evil, this idea of black and white, all of that is very sort of clearly mapped on the front here. I also like this round thing. The sort of yoga loving part of me was hoping it was like mandala like, and it is not, in fact. But it does look very like Game of Thrones, like those clock things that would turn at the beginning. So there is something that sort of reads very fantastical. You guys know I'm a real sucker for when the spine has a little repetition. And here we have the dark dragon. And we also have this beautiful sort of cloud-like thing. That almost looks like, fire breathing, but it also looks like a beautiful sort of cloud situation. So we have this idea of like almost like an explosion or fire breathing or clouds, and kind of like it almost looks like the solar system here. So that gets us to this question of world building. Whenever we have a dragon on the front of a book, we can be assured that the book and the world within are different, obviously, than our daily lives. And that is going to, necessitate a little mapping and a little sort of, a reorganization of our worlds. So I did learn from the son who likes to read fantasy novels that there's always a map, always a map. Those of you on the YouTube are seeing the map that I'm holding up right now. I like a map in any book. I think there was a book that I read. It was Circe by Madeline Miller. Incredible book. But I loved the fact that there was a map of the land of Circe's land, which was vaguely kind of Greece, but also like a very mythological land. And I was talking to that son and I was like, oh, it's so cool. I love this map. And he's like, there's always a map. There's always a map. So I felt a little bit like out of touch with the fantasy genre in that case. But I really love some of the details. We're not going to go into them here, but we have sun and moon and some very familiar aspects here. The arctile ocean, which, when I glanced at it, it looked like Atlantic. And we're sort of very familiar with some aspects of this topography, but it is very obviously a different world. I don't know how many readers would go back And actually, what am I talking about? I did hear from those younger people that there's a lot of like note taking and a lot of like plotting maps and a lot of interaction with these texts. I think largely on TikTok, on Book Talk, but it does invite you to do that when you in fact have this map at the front of the book. Then we have a page of blurbs, all the praise for Fourth Wing. And then we have the dedication to Aaron, to my own Captain America. So at first I thought this was her husband, but it is in fact one of her sons. She has 4 boys and 2 daughters, one of whom is adopted. And this book is in fact dedicated to one of the sons. Wouldn't it be funny if all of them were just like dedicated to this one kid, Aaron, and no one else got a book, a book dedicated to him? Probably not the case. Then this was surprising to me. This might just be like your run of the mill sort of trigger warning. And maybe this has to do with this idea of some of the constraints that maybe Mormon writers are working under. I don't want to like lean too heavily into that, but I do know that some of these publishers that come out of Utah have these sort of categories, different guides that will tell you, sort of what levels of like smuttiness these books are. So we have this thing at the beginning here about violence, brutal injuries, death, poisoning, graphic language, and sexual activities that are shown on the page. So it's like a trigger warning here, but it's also just like very clearly stating at the beginning what we are getting into. And I think actually, for a YA community, if you were a parent who really didn't want your child exposed to violence, then it would be helpful, in fact, to have this. I hope not that many parents are like policing their like late teens and what they are reading. But if they are, then I guess this would be helpful. But I was a little surprised. I was like, oh my gosh, okay, all right, duly warned. Okay, here we have another map. This is in fact of this war college. So Rebecca Yarros is very upfront about the fact that she is an army brat or something, and she had a father who was involved in the military. They moved around a lot, and her husband is also in the military. And she talks about being very interested and sort of invested in the military. So I found that really interesting. I was a little like, ooh, because I have some, difficulties with the idea of military, being somewhat of a pacifist myself. But I really did like the way that some of that was adapted in this book. This is also another element of this kind of world building. So not only do we have the map of the land and the provinces and the oceans, here we have this sort of map of the college, of this military establishment. Also really beautifully done, and again, a little reminiscent of Game of Thrones. I'm realizing that maybe Game of Thrones is derivative of Tolkien. I'm sure everything on some level is kind of derivative of Tolkien, which is probably derivative of the chivalric novels. But my only touchstone actually is Game of Thrones. And then I love this. Right before we dive into chapter 1, we have this. The following text has been faithfully transcribed from Navarian into the modern language by Jacinia Neilwort, curator of the Scribe Quadrant at Basgiath War College. I keep saying Basgiath War College. All events are true, and names have been preserved to honor the courage of those fallen. May their souls be commended to Malak. So again, this is some of this world building, the idea of Malak, throughout. Instead of the characters saying, oh God, they'll say, oh gods. So you have this idea of a world that is in fact, it's a poly... What is that? What do you call that? I can't remember. More than one God, which is obviously a departure from the college, from the Church of Latter-day Saints. But I also really love the kind of meta quality here. I mean, Rebecca Yarros here is really committed to the bit. Here she's saying, oh, this whole book was in fact translated from this other language into the modern language. So you have this idea of this as almost like a framing device, a very short, very brief, sort of not belabored framing device, but it really adds some verisimilitude. You're like, oh my God, okay, wait, this is obviously real because it is translated from the Navarian. So, you have this idea of really sort of creating a whole entire world, not just the world within the actual chapters. That continues because the epigraph, in fact, comes from the Dragon Rider's Codex. So oftentimes epigraphs, which I love, and I love to dig into them and sleuth through them, but epigraphs are often something that will be attributed to, a poet or a Greek philosopher or another writer, things that are kind of in the quote-unquote real world, and then you have the prose. Here we have the Dragon Rider's Codex, which is again, really committing to this idea of this world. That phrase, the sort of epigraph itself, is the following. A dragon without its rider is a tragedy. A rider without their dragon is dead. It is really placing front and center this notion of the sort of relationship between the dragon and the rider. We also understand the very, very high stakes. Right at the very beginning, we know that this book is very high stakes. The very first line is, conscription day is always the deadliest. So, and her mantra the whole time is like, I will not die today. I will not die today. So we are starting with very, very high stakes, which again fits in with the medieval thing and also provides a lot of really delicious tension. One thing that I really like about this epigraph is that it is repeated on page 43. And I read a thing once, it was someone talking about a song that comes up at the beginning of a movie and then it comes up again later. And his point was that you can't really love a new song until you've heard it at least, once in the past. The second time you've heard it is really when you'll sort of latch on to it because it feels familiar and because it is associated now with something in your life. So I loved when I got to page 43 and we had verbatim repetition of this little thing here. A dragon without its rider is a tragedy. A rider without their dragon is dead. So, it's memorable also. But when we have that second, iteration of it, it is so delightful, partially because it's underscoring the high stakes, but it's also reminding us of this thing that we already know. And that is a very clever way to sort of win the reader over. The reader at that point is like, oh my God, wait, I'm on the inside. Like, I know where this came from. This came from the rider's Codex. So you sort of are like, oh my God, wait, I'm really part of this world. So then we're just going to look at the very first paragraph. Conscription day is always the deadliest. Maybe that's why the sunrise is especially beautiful this morning, because I know it might be my last. So again, very high stakes. The other thing I will say about the prose in general is that we have this first person narrator. It is told from the point of view of Violet. And I always forget her last name. Sorengale? Wow, that just came to me out of nowhere. I always forget it. I always stumble, but it really just came to me then. But this Violet character, she's young. She's very much at the center, obviously, of this story, and she's frail and she's little, but we are hearing her story, and it is told by her in the first person, which is very compelling. First person narrations can be a little limiting because technically you only have the information that person is privy to. But we're going to talk about the way that, in fact, Rebecca Yarros very skillfully gets around the limitations of this first person narrator and makes it feel much richer. Okay, so actually, we're going to read a little bit more here. I tighten up the straps of my heavy canvas rucksack and trudge up the wide staircase of the stone fortress I call home. My chest heaves with exertion, my lungs burning by the time I reach the stone corridor leading to General Sorengale's office. This is what 6 months of intense physical training have given me, the ability to barely climb 6 flights of stairs with a 30-pound pack. So there are a few things that are happening here that are important. One, the very beginning, this idea of a rucksack and the idea of the wide staircase and the stone fortress I call home. All of that is obviously very medieval. Again, when I say medieval, I mean sort of a pseudo-Western European, sort of medieval feel. So we also have this very beginning intimation of the fact that in fact Violet is limited in some ways, and that is a very interesting aspect of the story. I'm not gonna spoil it for you. You're gonna have to figure out yourself what it is that she is struggling with. But we have this kind of question here, like she's having a very hard time walking up the stairs, and yet we find out she's done 6 months of really rigorous training. So you're a little bit like, wait, what's happening here? And that is that kind of very purposeful tension that comes with these unanswered questions that Rebecca Yarros is so good at. So this I also loved. She says, this is what 6 months of intense physical training has given me, The ability to barely climb 6 flights of stairs with a 30-pound pack. I'm so fucked. So, of course, I love the word fuck, and I love the word fucked, but I really loved the insouciance here. I mean, this is the 3rd paragraph, right at the beginning, in the voice of our narrator, we have this, I'm so fucked. So one of the ways that I think Rebecca Yarros makes this book feel so immediate and so compelling and so kind of intimate and revealing is that all of the language is very contemporary. Whenever the people are talking, it's, they're not speaking Dothraki, and it's not even like some sort of antiquated British English. It's very contemporary and it's very strong. There's also a lot of swearing. So this is the first of the ways in which Rebecca Yarros is, sort of going astray of this Mormon code of conduct. There is a lot of swearing in this book, and it is not the swearing of my friend Darren from graduate school. It is, in fact, very, sort of standard fuck this and fuck that, and I'm so fucked, and all of this kind of stuff. But it is, it's interesting that she doesn't seem to have any qualms using dirty language here. The other thing that I'm just going to lob out there at this point, on her website, I just looked very briefly at her about thing, mostly because I was so interested to look at her children. I was like, oh my God, who has 6 children? Wow, it just seemed so difficult to me. And of course, it's like a perfect picture of a perfect family. But she leads off with this idea that she loves all things I can't remember if it's chocolate or something. There's something she loves. I think it's chocolate. All things chocolate, all things caffeine, and all things paleo. So I don't really know paleo diet. That's caveman diet. But the caffeine thing, I was like, oh, wait, we are really leading with caffeine. And then she's like, no, I'm serious. I need an IV drip of caffeine, which to me seemed really upfront about, it's not something that people usually lead with, I really, really need my caffeine. So the sense of really introducing yourself with that to me was signaling that she has a slightly broader code of conduct than what the Church of Latter-day Saints is stipulating for people. So I did not dig deeply into Rebecca Yarros and her faith, and personally I don't really care. Also, this is a good time for a quick note. There are a lot of people of color who are mentioned in this book in ways that I find interesting, and they're not a lot of them. But I got the sense that there were some names that to me read as really Latinx, and there were some people who were somewhat artfully described. It was things like her dark brows were even darker than, her skin or than her dark brown skin or whatever it was. You have a sense of not everybody being white and blonde, which is, I think, what we associate with, the Mormon community. So you have this idea of an effort being made towards some diversity. I wonder to what extent that's kind of checking the box, doing whatever it is that her editors and her agent feel that she needs to do in order to reach a large readership. Okay, so now that we have covered a little bit of the prose, I want to just very quickly touch on the idea of matriarchy. This is something that colors the entire book, but I was interested in how much of it is really front-loaded. We find out at the very beginning, in fact, that the mother is the general. So Violet's mother is the general. And in the beginning, there was a certain amount of intrigue for me in the sense of trying to understand how the general's relationship with her daughters worked. We also find out that the father has died, I think about a year beforehand. What's interesting to me too is that the father was very bookish. The father was the one who encouraged Violet, to be a scribe. And suddenly Violet is changing course. But the father's out of the picture. So the father, just in the strict hierarchy would have been sort of lower in some ways than the mother. That's the impression you get at the beginning. You also get the impression that he's dead, that he died of a heart attack. So we have no patriarchy. We have just a very serious matriarchy happening. We also have a brother who has died, an older brother. So we have this sense of all the men in the family are gone, all 2 of them. So they were outnumbered from the start, but now they're both dead. So right at the beginning, you have this very strong sense of a matriarchy, literally sheerly just because there are no male players in the family, but also, of course, because of the idea of the mom as literally being the general. And then Mira as being just a total badass, and Violet, despite her physical limitations and her lack of lung capacity or whatever it is, that together with this idea that she wanted to be a scribe and she's a small person and she's fragile and whatnot, you have her going for this thing that is in fact very difficult. So this is a group of very competent, very ambitious women who are really, big, important people in this world that we are entering. There's also a lot of emphasis from the beginning on female relationships and female friendships. So right from the start, the minute, that Violet enters this world, she becomes friends with Rhiannon. I always want to call her Rhiannon. And in fact, I did until I listened to part of this. Oh my God, you guys. I'm just going to tell you right now. The voice was so, it made it sound so cheeseball. It was just so much better when I was reading it because I had a voice in my head that was not this melodramatic, really into it kind of voice that made it sound just so cheeseball. So I also read a whole thing online about how initially this was released and people were really disgruntled because you could actually tell that the narrator had a cold. She was so congested and sniffly, and the voice would change so much from chapter to chapter that certain listeners were confused because they were wait, is this a new narrator? So there were so many complaints that the company had them re-record it. So I was not that happy with it and was wondering if I was not alone. And not only was I not alone, but in fact, it sounds like the first version was much worse because in fact, the narrator was physically ill. So, I hate to shit on the audio version, but I will tell you that I found the reading version, the paper book version, much more satisfying, in fact, than the audio. Okay, but back to the story. We have this idea of Rhiannon, who, I'm sorry, see, I keep saying Rhiannon because I realized a long time ago that Rihanna, the singer, she calls herself Rihanna, she goes by Rihanna, but Rhiannon is a very good friend of Violet's right from the start, and that is a relationship that is very important. So not only do you have the idea of this general and the matriarchy and no sort of male figures, but you also have, this sorority. The relationship with Mira is very important, and then also this relationship with Rhiannon. Oh my gosh, wow. I'm going to keep doing that. So, just be forewarned. I also had a sense too, this book is very relationship heavy in some ways. There's plenty of, strategizing and action and dragons and flying and combat and all sorts of different stuff happening. Certainly plenty of that. But there is a lot of emphasis on relationships. And that was another reason that this romantasy seems very apt. It was also another reason why I could not really, in good conscience, recommend it completely to my husband and my son, who I think maybe would have tired, who would have just been okay, I don't really need to know about all of the friendships among all of these people. We are going to move on from matriarchy and talk about exposition. So exposition is simply information, and pacing is the way that information is kind of meted out in a story. And she's really good at both of those things. So I mentioned earlier that sometimes a first-person narrator can be a little limiting in the sense that, really, if it's Violet Sorengale, I'm really nailing the last name today. If it's Violet who's telling the story, then really, the logic of this world is such that we can only know things that she knows. The way that Rebecca Yarros gets around that, I think, is very artful. She's actually violating kind of one of the main rules that you learn in MFA programs, which is that you should never put exposition in dialogue. So essentially that anytime you have someone having a conversation, we should not be learning new information. You don't want it to be hey, remember yesterday when you got in that crazy car crash? You don't want the reader to be learning about these things in kind of clunky conversation that would never actually happen because the information is so central to the narrative. But Yarros does it in a way that is really effective, and I think it helps her to get around some of this kind of limitation of first person. So we're going to look at the idea of exposition very briefly in some little snippets. So on page 7, this is Mira telling her that she can't carry this pack. No, you can't. You're barely thrice the weight of the pack. The parapet is roughly 18 inches wide, 200 feet above ground, and the last time I looked, those were rain clouds moving in. They're not going to give you a rain delay just because the bridge might be a little slick, sis. You'll fall, you'll die. So we're getting a lot of information here about like what she is facing. Presumably Violet knows these things about the parapet, and presumably, I mean, I don't know if Violet has looked out the window and noticed the storm clouds, and certainly Violet knows that the pack is much bigger than she is, or I guess vice versa. She's, 3 times, she's thrice the weight of the pack. So these are all things that should be clunky. It should be redundant information. It should feel like information that is kind of superfluous that Violet already knows. But the way that it's delivered, and Mira is such a badass, that it really, in fact, feels like organic information, and that she's just sort of chastising her sister, not kind of reciting a bunch of information that they both already knew. So down a little bit further, Mira is telling her that she has too many things in her rucksack and certainly can't bring a book. All you'll be is another tombstone, another name scorched in stone. Ditch the books. Dad gave this one to me, I murmur, pressing the book against my chest. Maybe it's childish, just a collection of stories that warn us against the lure of magic and even demonize dragons, but it's all I have left. So again, we have this reminder of her link to her father. We have this kind of inkling about should dragons in fact be demonized? There's a lot of information here that is being conveyed in a very economical way. And then on page 9, we have more advice from Mira that is, again, sort of telling us these very important things that we need to know in ways that are very efficient. Be observant. Quiet is fine, but make sure you notice everything and everyone around you to your advantage. You've read the Codex? A few times. The rule book for the Riders Quadrant is a fraction of the length of the other divisions, probably because riders have trouble obeying rules. So this is so clever because she's telling us a lot about this community that she is entering. She comes from the scribe world. Her father is very bookish, and she's entering this world. And with this idea of the book being smaller, she's conveying this sort of entire ethos of this other group, which is that they don't, in fact, obey rules, which is interesting because that is so not military. And you wonder how this is all going to play out. And then on page 153, this is a little further, obviously, in the text, but it's not any kind of spoiler or anything. So one of the things I was interested in when I began reading this was my shitty memory. My memory is terrible, especially my memory for plot. Like when we were watching Game of Thrones, I never knew what was going on. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I had sort of like the big picture and sort of the general gist, but I really did not follow any of the intricacies. So I was curious about how much Rebecca Yarros was going to kind of hold my hand and situate me in a way that made me sort of, feel confident that I understood what was happening. Yarros does a very good job of situating us in what is happening. You have a lot of these kind of clarifying things, again, that could feel redundant and unnecessary, but are really artfully done and do a very good job of keeping you kind of grounded in what is a very long book. So I mentioned before that pacing is just this idea of meting out information. And I'm not going to read anything about the pacing, but what I will say is that right from the beginning, we have really beautiful tension that is built. So one of the things you want pacing to be, again, this is just sort of how you are giving information. You want it to feel kind of even, which it is in this book, but you also want to give the reader information that is incomplete so that they're wondering about things. Things, for example, like the general. In the beginning, I was like, whoa, what's up with this mom? Like, there's going to be some sort of tension here. So you have these questions that are established because the information is incomplete, but also you have the right amount of information that is sort of, divvied out to you at different points to both sort of keep you grounded enough, but also to keep that tension and intrigue moving forward. So one of the things I also really like and think that she does so well, and it really violates all the rules of sort of good prose, is how transparent she is about a lot of things. So on page 13, this is Mira, and she's sort of giving her last bit of advice to her sister Violet. I just remembered. Her voice drops, and I lean in, my heart jumping at the urgency of her tone. Stay the hell away from Xaden Ryerson. The air rushes from my lungs, that name. That Xaden Ryerson, she confirms, fear lacing her gaze. He's a third year, and he will kill you the second he finds out who you are. So again, I actually wrote in the side, because it does seem a little bit heavy-handed, but there's, again, this certain kind of levity, and there's enough excitement and enough stuff happening that you're like, okay, that may have been like a little bit much and a little melodramatic, but like you're certainly turning the pages. One of those youngsters I mentioned before said that on TikTok, she heard Rebecca Yarros saying that she came up with the name Xaden Ryerson. Xaden is Xaden, just because it sounded hot, which I think is funny. And that might be totally apocryphal, that story, but I like it. Okay, and then on pages 19 and 20, we have kind of a continuation of that same idea, this Xaden Ryerson person. And again, this is that kind of transparent, just like stating these things in a way that should feel kind of like overdone and redundant and too obvious, but really, in fact, work well. So down at the bottom of page 19, Xaden sucks in a deep breath and the muscle in his jaw flexes once, twice. Your mother captured my father and oversaw his execution. Wait, like he has the only right to hatred here? Rage races through my veins. Your father killed my older brother. Seems like we're even. Which again, like part of me is like, he's like, yeah, well, your mom saw my dad's execution. And she's like, yeah, well, your father killed my brother. It's so effective in some way, but it like shouldn't work, and yet somehow it does. So, and also in some, we're on page 19 here of the book. We're getting a lot of really important, juicy information, but it's coming so quickly and it's kind of spread out in this nice way that builds this expectation that there's going to be more and more and more of this. So I think the pacing is really one of the strongest aspects of the book, and also this transparency where she's just laying out information and we're just going to keep rolling and we're going to keep getting more and more, intrigue and more tension, but also more information. One of the things that this enables us, this kind of pacing and these kinds of, lot of information coming at us, is it allows for these very satisfying story arcs. So, I think everyone sort of acknowledges that as readers, one thing that is very satisfying is to have a lot of like evolution or change on the part of a character. I myself do not believe that in order for a book to be successful, you have to have change in a character. It's very interesting to me, in fact, when a character is very static and doesn't, in fact, change over time. But I do understand why, in fact, that is satisfying. So in this case, we have a couple of different arcs. Of course, we have these really, really big questions, like, is Violet going to survive? And like, which one of these dudes is Violet going to choose? All of these sorts of things. But we also have these very small arcs that are really well done. So on page 15, we have the beginning of one of these kind of mini arcs that are so satisfying. So this is right at the beginning when the first years are about to cross the parapet and there's a lot of tension and they're all just meeting each other. This is Rhiannon speaking. I'm Rhiannon Matthias, by the way. Dylan, the blonde guy responds with an enthusiastic wave. Violet. I give them a tense smile of my own, blatantly ignoring Mira's earlier suggestion that I avoid friendships and only forge alliances. I feel like I've been waiting my entire life for this day. Dylan shifts his pack on his back. Can you believe we actually get to do this? It's a dream come true. So again, this should be a little heavy-handed. Here we're introduced to Dylan. So the way he responds is with an enthusiastic wave, which should be, a bit of a red flag in the sense that, like, this guy might not be long for the world. Like, he's just, too much goodness here. And then he goes on and he's so excited about riding on the dragon. Then on the next page, we have the following. Do your parents approve? Dylan asks, because my mom's been begging me to change my mind for months. I keep telling her that I'll have better chances for advancement as a rider, but she wanted me to enter the healer quadrant. So you're like, oh no, now we have like Dylan's mom is the one who's like worried about him, and Dylan is having to say, Mom, no, it's going to be fine. I mean, as the reader, you should be like, uh-oh, like Dylan is in jeopardy here, especially when the mom is in the picture. You're like, oh no, uh-oh. Also the fact that he was going to enter the healer quadrant. So you're given information that is creating this tension in you. So then on page 20, so like 3 or 4 pages later, this is Xaden and Violet together when Violet and her classmates are about to cross the parapet. I hold his glare as if winning this staring competition would gain me entrance to the quadrant instead of crossing the parapet behind him. Either way, I'm getting across. Mira isn't going to lose both her siblings. His hand clenches into fists and he tenses. I prepare for the strike. He might throw me off the tower, but I won't make it easy for him. You all right? Rhiannon asks, her gaze jumping between Xaden and me. He glances at her. You're friends? We met on the stairs, she said, squaring her shoulders. He looks down, noting our mismatched shoes, and arches a brow. His hands relax. Interesting. Are you going to kill me? I lift my chin another inch. A scream rends the air, and Rhiannon and I both jerk our attention to the parapet just in time to see Dylan slip. I mean, dun, dun, dun. Like, I just, we knew it was coming. And again, this tension was building. I mean, maybe you didn't. And honestly, like, it's early in the book to have this happen. But it's this really deft way that she's setting this up. And it's very satisfying, in fact, on some level, when, like, the kind of, like, a little bit of a chump kid here is, like, he just dies right in the beginning. And in fact, then right across at the beginning of chapter 2, we have the second paragraph begins, Dylan is dead. So again, this very declarative, transparent, kind of obvious, potentially overwritten sentence that is really well done. Okay, we're going to take a quick look at cliche through my glasses. In fact, I went and found them so that I don't have to be squinting at this tiny print. A word about cliche. It is really, really anathema to really good prose. You should do everything you can if you are a literary fiction writer to avoid cliche. It's tired, it's old, it just doesn't really buy you much. It generally feels kind of cheeseball. But what I will say is that it is a very good way to signal certain things to your reader. It's very efficient. If it is a book that is not even purporting to be literary fiction, if it is a genre fiction being romantasy, also fantasy and romance and mystery. These are books that aren't sort of trading on like their inventive language. They're trading on things like plot and world building and really good pacing, all of the things that Yarros is doing. But cliche also can be kind of molded and sort of shifted in ways that can make it more effective than it is just standing alone. And that is one thing that Yarros is very good at. I mean, sometimes I was like, oh my God, dude, like, I really think we could have done a little better here. But a lot of the cliche, I was impressed with how she sort of modified it in ways that made it much more appealing. On page 6, this is when Mira is helping her pack up. In the 30 minutes I've been gone, all my personal items have been packed into crates that now sit stacked in the corner. My stomach sinks to the hardwood floor. She had my entire life boxed. So this idea of my stomach sinks, that kind of cliche is like very obvious. It's very familiar to us. It also signals something that's actually a very good example of like the way that cliche can really be an effective shorthand. Like my stomach sank. Like what that is telling you is actually a lot of information, and it's better than saying like I felt so uneasy on some level. I mean, arguably, but it is an effective shorthand. And what I like here is Yarros says, my stomach sinks to the hardwood floor. So it's not just my stomach sank, it's in fact giving us a little more, and it's kind of modifying the cliche so it doesn't feel quite so cliche. Okay, another example on page 30. I like this one. She says, I'd watch your back with that one if I were you. I nod. I'm going to have to watch my back and every other part of my body. So I think, first of all, I think that is so funny. Partially, it's like a defensive thing, but it also is really sort of foregrounding the idea of the body and this idea of the body as having desires and fears. I just think it's very clever the way that she has done it here. And then on 43, honestly, there's so many examples of this, but these are just a select few that I think are, pretty indicative of the way that she handles cliches so well. On 43, this is kind of in the lower middle of the page. My heart threatens to beat out of my chest, and I absolutely agree with it because I'd like to run too. Just thinking that I'm supposed to ride one of these is fucking ludicrous. Okay, first of all, I love fucking ludicrous, like so good. She's really like hammering home this point here about how crazy it is. Again, this is also that transparency. It's also that modern language, fucking ludicrous. Like that's a well-turned phrase as far as I'm concerned. But this idea of my heart threatens to beat out of my chest, and I absolutely agree with it, is like there's something there where she's taking cliche and then she's sort of building on it in a way that I find very satisfying. Okay, and then some of this tone we have heard throughout, but I want to sort of touch on a couple examples of this kind of levity. It's not like hilarious humor, but there's like a certain tone that allows us to not take it too seriously. We see that at the very beginning when she's like, I'm so fucked. She's not taking anything too seriously. So that the reader is also able to kind of move right along through the fiction. I mean, we're not like belaboring the fact that Dylan slipped and died. I mean, there's a certain levity that allows us to not get too mired in any one thing and allows us to keep moving forward. This is when Mira and the general are discussing Violet right in front of her. Having my sister throw my inadequacies in my face is another. Are you calling me weak? No, Mira squeezes my hand, just fragile. That's not any better. Dragons don't bond fragile women, they incinerate them. So, like, that's kind of funny. So she's small. Mom scans me up and down, taking in the generous fit of the cream-belted tunic and pants I selected this morning for my potential execution. I snort. Are we just listing my faults now? So again, like here, her mom and her sister are like saying all of these things about her that are like, oh, she's weak, she's small, she's fragile. But first of all, we have this idea of like, the dragons won't bond, they'll incinerate. So there's like a levity there and sort of like an insouciance that I think is very appealing. But then this idea, they're saying things that could be taken as very cruel. And we have this line, I snort. Are we just listing my faults now? So the snorting is funny. It means, in fact, like literally she is not taking it too seriously because she's laughing. But also there's that construction that is very contemporary, and it's one that is used a lot now, which is like, are we just blah, blah, blah now? Like, are we just, the example here is perfect. Are we just listing my faults now? So it again, there's this contemporary thing, but it also is adding like a certain amount of levity because she's not too worried about these criticisms that are being leveled by her mom, the general, and her sister, who's like some eminent, rider. And then on 13, we have another example of this kind of levity. So this has to do with dragons and the role of dragons in the college. It seems cruel, but the first rule of living at Basgiath is never question a dragon. They tend to cremate anyone they find rude. So again, this idea of incineration or cremate, and this idea of like they tend to cremate people who are rude. It's not like some big dramatic thing and she's really worried about like what's going to happen if she criticizes a dragon. It's this thing of like, oh, I better not be rude or else I'm going to get scorched. So there's a certain sort of lack of real concern that helps the reader feel, we're invested for sure, but we're not like overwrought about the whole thing. Then down a little further. Okay, and then on page 15, this is when Mira and Violet are parting, which again, like could be this really like mawkish kind of sentimental, like, or like really sad, really difficult moment. And it's not, it's kind of a lighter tone that Yarros is giving us here. So these are the two sisters on the top of 15. We pause at the doorway and turn toward each other. Don't die, Violet. I'd hate to be an only child. She grins and walks away, sauntering past the line of gawking candidates as word spreads of exactly who she is and what she's done. Tough to live up to that, the woman ahead of me says. So we have this idea, first of all, she's like, yeah, don't die. And then she grins. So we have this idea of her as not really being too worried or too bothered by this whole thing. Nothing is going to be sort of too heavy, and we can really get to the next bit of action. Before we really dive in to the hardcore smut here, I just want to touch very briefly on the certain like sex forward thing and like sex positive tone that is established right at the beginning of the book. And again, I had a hard time squaring this with the idea of the Mormon code of conduct. I mean, again, maybe the fantasy realm, maybe the idea of like dragons and stuff, and like, these women warriors, maybe because we have this matriarchy and all of this kind of stuff, it's not sort of like normal marriage outside of wedlock because these are not women who are necessarily going to ever get married. Although, it sounds like the mom and dad were married. So, there's some pieces here that seem to run a little contrary to the church. Not that that really matters, but just in light of our conversation earlier. But I really did appreciate sort of these matriarchal tones. And then they sort of moved into a lot of feminist stuff. These are women, again, who are very competent and very capable and really very heroic in lots of ways. And right from the beginning, there is this real sex positivity. And by that, I mean women who are, have desire, and women who have agency, and women who understand that sexual desire is not shameful, and that it is empowering, and that you can feel empowered by having sexual partners and having sexual pleasure. So I really did appreciate a nod to that right at the very beginning of the book. On page 11, we have Mira and her sister. We have Mira and Violet, and Mira is giving some advice. Don't mess around with second years. If you want to get laid, and you should, she lifts her brows, often, considering you never know what the day brings, then screw around in your own year. Nothing is worse than cadets gossiping that you've slept your way to safety. So I'm free to take any of the first years I want to bed, I say with a little grin, just not second or third years. Exactly. She winks. So first of all, the idea of, she says, if you want to get laid, and you should, often. So I like the idea of her kind of appropriating this male language. I mean, mostly it's men who would say something like, hey, I want to get laid. I like the idea of Mira appropriating that, especially because Mira is very much like, she's like kind of like the Top Gun pilot. So we have this idea of her as using this kind of male-coded language, like, oh, you should get laid, and you should get laid often. So, and I love that idea of like, if you're going to be incinerated tomorrow by a dragon, then you should have sex today, because sex is good and sex is positive and it's something that is worth pursuing. So all of the message here on page 11, I really like. I also like the fact that it is definitely setting up another one of these sort of moments of tension. Like this idea of like, oh, wait, she's like, okay, you can mess around with anyone in your year, and you should do that a lot. And, for sure, first years, like, have at it. But she is setting up this idea of like, whatever you do, don't have sex with second and third year people, which of course is going to lead our Violet into this idea of having sex with second and third year people. So there is so much at the very beginning, even before we get to this long spell, before we have the smut. The last element that we're going to look at, in fact, is the smuttiness of the book. So it was so funny because this was sort of billed to me as like the sexy dragon book, or the dragon smut book or something. And so I was really expecting, I was expecting more, and I'm reading and reading and reading, and I'm like, okay, well, like nobody's even like, there's nothing is happening. There's like a lot of like tension and more tension, and right, we have this kind of question at the beginning about like who of these people, like the bad boy or the good boy. I mean, here we are again, sort of good and evil. This question of like who's she gonna go for, and then finally, on page 192, we have the very first kiss of the whole entire book. So, in fact, when I spoke to the gang of youngsters about this, one of them was like, it's a slow burn. And she said it's not uncommon in these books to have the first kiss be at the very end of the first book, the first volume. And I was like, okay, like, that's fine. But then, like, I'm not sure that they all need to be, like, so smutty. This is what I was thinking before I actually got to the, like, smut part. So on 192, we have this description of the first kiss. And I'm not going to say who the person is in case you haven't gotten there. In fact, if you want to skip ahead. No spoilers. This was so funny to me. This is when she is finally with, alone with one of these guys. This is a guy speaking. You have to know how I feel about you. His thumb strokes over my cheek, his eyes searching for something, and then his mouth is on mine. His lips are soft, but the kiss is firm, and delight races up my spine. After years, he is finally kissing me. The thrill is gone in less than a heartbeat. There's no heat, no energy, no sharp slice of lust. Disappointment sours the moment, but not for him. He's all smiles as he pulls away. It was over in an instant. It was everything I've ever wanted, except, shit, I don't want it anymore. Which is so funny to me. And this is so well done. There's so much buildup to this moment. And then it happens. And then we have this very sort of clever thing here. It was everything I've ever wanted, except, shit, I don't want it anymore. So that also is reminding me of the fact that this is written in the present tense. That is something that usually bothers me. I didn't even really notice. I mean, it really does like keep us moving along. But back to the more important thing here. This thing of like shit, which is so funny. Again, there's that tone. I love the expletive. It's really like keeping us grounded. And it's also very intimate. It's like what you would say to a girlfriend. You're just like, oh shit, like that's totally not what I wanted anymore. So I thought that was very funny. And then I had to wait a long time and I was like, oh my God, like if this is like the big heated first kiss, then like I think this is all going to be very, very tame. Then I got to the real stuff toward the end here. So back when I was doing my 3/4 of the MFA program that I did, one of the teachers had very good advice about writing sex scenes. Although I'm so distracted by any writing about sex because I just, the words, like the word choice, and I just get so like kind of tied up and like, no pun intended. It's very, very hard to do well. So her advice, which I think was very good, is just describe what is happening. And she meant not in cliche. So one type of cliche that is very, I think, very annoying in lots of ways is cliche that has to do with the body. So, and there are lots of cliches for very good reason about sex. We have a lot of language for sex, but we just don't, it's not language that we share very often with each other, and certainly not in, your normal YA fantasy book. So that was very good advice. Like just say what is happening without like lots of, metaphor and simile, lots of figurative language, and also trying to sort of not, use phrases that are really hackneyed. So on page 416, we have the following. We're just diving in. He crushes his mouth to mine and pulls me fully into his lap so I'm straddling him. He kisses me so deep that I lose myself in it, in him. There are no words as he takes off my sash, my top, and unbuttons my skirt, all without breaking the kiss. Stand, he says against my lips. My heart thunders. So again, I don't think we need the my heart thunders part. Like up until then, like pretty good. But then like my heart thunders, we just don't need that. The reader should have her or his own reaction to what is happening. We don't need to like be told exactly like how it is feeling in her body, because we can sort of imagine what the rest of this is feeling like. So, and then I'm going to skip over a little bit here. He's on his feet in a heartbeat, and then that again, cliche, that is a cliche that we don't need. How about just he stands, He's on his feet in a heartbeat, and then his mouth is on mine, and I stop counting. I'm too busy chasing the strokes of his tongue, feeling the ripples of his muscles beneath my fingertips to give a shit where my clothes are going. So that's funny. I like that, like, again, the kind of insouciance there. I feel air rush against my legs as my skirt hits the floor, and I help him out by kicking off my slippers while I suck on his tongue. Okay, first of all, I feel the air rush against my legs. Like that for me, that was a bit awkward. So I like the idea of just like telling us what happens, but how about just like my skirt fell to the floor? So I think there's some of this is a little bit overwritten. And then of course, all sex scenes, this is very interesting to me, actually. The sex scenes are often awkward because of things like sex is so kind of individual, and so our experience of it is so private and in some ways so limited, excluding porn, but like our own sort of experience of it, that we have our own preferences and we have our own experiences. And so it's strange, but it's both like really fun to read about what other people are up to in the bedroom or like wherever this is happening. But it's also very strange because you're like, oh my God, wait, do people like that? And this idea here, just some of it just ends up feeling kind of cringy. This part about kicking off my slippers while I suck on his tongue. Like, I'm like, really sucking on his tongue? That doesn't sound good to me. Like, I have an image of like him sticking his tongue out and her like really sucking on it. So it's very, again, what I'm getting to here is it's very, very difficult. He groans, his hands flying over my back, laces loosen in record time, and the corset falls to the floor, leaving me in my underwear. Daggers, both his and mine, hit the ground as he unstraps the sheaths at my thighs and undoes his own. It's a glorious cacophony of metal until we're both naked and he's kissing me breathless. So the daggers, I like a good phallic symbol, maybe we can read that in here. Maybe we can be like, okay, they're both like very sort of armed and manly. And in some ways she has her own phallus because she's like a rider and she's like doing all the things the guys are doing. And she's got her dagger and he's got his, and they're sort of letting down, their defenses here by letting them fall. But I'm not entirely convinced that Rebecca Yarros is wanting us to do all of that. She might just be like wanting us to read along here. Also, glorious cacophony. I mean, talk about overwritten. Like, I think we don't need, that kind of flourish right then. He grabs the back of my thighs and lifts, sweeping my feet out from underneath me. My back hits the bed with a slight bounce, and honestly, I should have seen that move coming, given that he's been putting me on my back for the better part of a year now. That's kind of funny. Like, I like the slight bounce, and I like this idea of like kind of coming out of this moment. Like, it's not too overwrought and too precious or too kind of sentimental or like too intense, because she's, referring to this the fact that they've been doing kind of like their wrestling and their combat. Oh, sorry. That was a dog. He's okay. Everything's okay. So then, dropping to my knees beside the bed and dragging me across the soft coverlet to the edge, I tease as my ass hits the end of the bed. He grins, and before I can get another word in, his mouth is between my thighs. I suck in a sharp breath and throw my head back at the sheer pleasure of his tongue, licking and swirling around my clit. Oh, gods. Which one are you calling out for? He asks against my flesh. Because it's just you and me in this room, Vi, and I don't share. Okay, I think that's all we need. Once we got to the clitoris part, I feel like, you can imagine from there. So the one thing I will say is, like, I think, finally I got to a part where I was like, oh my God, okay, once there's mention of the clitoris, like, then we have really gotten into like the land of erotica. But I also, I appreciated the fact that, like, it's very much in keeping with the levity and with the tone and with the sort of feminist overtones of the rest of the book. I just thought it was so well done. So I'm going to leave it there. I really enjoyed my excursion into the world of Rebecca Yarros and this Fourth Wing situation. I really just fully understand why so many people are really spending a lot of time reading these big, fat books. So I also hope that this little deep dive has given you a sense of all of the things that she is doing right. I mean, is this, incredible literary fiction? No, but that is not what she is striving for. And I really enjoyed digging in to what makes this book tick and why, in fact, it's really worthwhile and really a masterclass in some ways of what makes a fantasy, a romantasy, really so successful. So thank you so much for tuning in, and head straight back to the Fox page and find something else to listen to. Happy reading.